I'm going to go through a setup for doing rotoscoping in Photoshop. I'm going to create a new file here. I've brought up the film and video presets, and I'll view all of them here. The first one is the high def video, the 1080p. This is your standard high def resolution. There's also standard the 720p, which is 1280 by 720. This is one I often use in class for students to render. It's a little lighter weight than the 1080p, and it'll fit on everyone's screen pretty easily for viewing. Now, when you're painting a video frame by frame, even if you are sharing a lower resolution, I recommend creating things at a higher resolution because you have the same amount of work and then you have a higher quality original. If you were planning on putting a lot of time and effort and wanted the highest quality, you could even go to like the ultra high definition, or what's commonly called 4K. If your computer is up to it, it uses more resources, but same number of brush strokes, but you have a higher quality original that you can go to. For my demo here, I'm just going to work with the 720p, create that. And here we are in Photoshop. Okay. I want to be able to see the whole image here, have a little bit of room for the timeline. And right now we just have a white background. Now, video, the default background for video, since it's additive colors, to have a black background, but I'm going to be bringing in source material that is shot on a white background, so I'm going to keep the white background here. I have the timeline showing. If you don't have that, you can go up to Window and select Timeline to bring up this panel. Now I am going to create not a frame animation, but a video timeline. So I select that and click Create, and here we go. We've got default. Now you might hear some rain or thunder in the background. It's a first real thunderstorm we've had in Chicago this year. So just be, if you're hearing things, that's what's going on. I'm not in a war zone. So the default here was 5 seconds long, but that's something we can adjust. And I'm going to adjust it based on our source material. So I'm going to bring in our source. So I'm going to go to Layer, Video Layers, New Video Layer from a file. And I'm going to use this Flash video file. Downloaded it a long time ago. Seemed to be copyright free. Bring it in. Now this is a really low resolution video. It's 16:9 aspect ratio, as is our workspace. But this is only like 400 pixels wide. Now that's really low res video, and I think that's one reason it was free to download, is that it was just kind of a sample instead of like what they were selling. But since I'm actually painting the video, this is just for reference, and so the lower resolution really doesn't matter to me. But I am going to scale this up. Now when you try to scale, it wants to convert it into a smart object. And that's good. What that means is that it's not actually going to take the video and resample it, which would take a long time and make a bigger video. It's just putting it in a container, and we're going to resize the container to fit our screen. But the original video is unaltered. Click OK. And see, that's plenty of resolution for me to paint with. Now I scrub through here, we see she's just kind of doing an undulating back and forth, some different expressions there. Get back on here. Now, you don't have to make a cyclic animation, but if I wanted to create a looping animation, which animators often do because That means you can take the same number of painted frames and loop them over and over and have a longer animation, basically get more out of your work. So I'm going to go through here. She goes off to my right and then back over here, and find a pose that's kind of similar to the one I had before. And I'm going to trim the video. It kind of snaps to where my timeline is. I'm going to trim my background to the same length. And then I'm going to play this. Now if I look in the settings here, it's set to loop playback. And when she comes back to the beginning, there's a pretty big jump because it doesn't really line up. It doesn't really loop properly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a couple of keyframes so I animate the video clip so that it comes back to the same point. Now, I'm going to create some guides here. I'm going to go in and create a layer. I'm not going to name it. It's not going to be there very long. And I'm just going to take a brush and just so, you know, I'm sure I can see it, I'm going to give it some color. And we see she kind of, this is her position, and kind of mark where her head and hair is, mark where her eyes are. So this is just a reference. When I scroll, and I'm going to also trim this same length as everything else. When I go to the end here, you see she's a bit off from where she started. So I'm going to go to the beginning, open up my I don't have a lot of screen real estate here because I'm working in 1280 by 720. But here's the video layer. If I open it up, these are things we can animate. We can animate a transformation of the smart object. We can animate its opacity and styles. Styles is like layer styles. So what I want to do is animate the position of this video, layer 1, which I should, go ahead and call source. So it's clear. So that's my source. I don't want to lock it right now because I'm going to transform it. So I'm going to set a keyframe at the beginning. So when I click on the little stopwatch, that turns on keyframing for transformations. The little diamond with the yellow means that there's a keyframe and I'm on it. If I scrub off of it, the yellow diamond goes away and it's open. That means I'm not on a keyframe. If I go to the end, I can transform this. And I'm going to just use the move tool. That's a transformation. So I have my source, and I'm going to move it over, kind of split the difference where like her shoulder would have to go up here, the shoulder would have to come down here, and her eyes would have to shift a bit. So find something that's kind of close. There might be another frame where her shoulder isn't up so high that would be better. But I'm going to go ahead and go with this here. Now when I moved, notice that it automatically created a keyframe on my current frame here. When I scrub through, she goes from there to there. Okay, so that's good. Now basically I don't need this layer. I could throw it away. If I loop the playback, she comes back to about the same position. You see a little bit of a jump but it's not bad. Since I'm going to be painting this, I can kind of make some compensations. All right, so let's finish setting up our layers. Now that I have my source formatted, one thing I'm looking at is how long this is. I am on, I'm 3.5 seconds in here. I can see that down here, 3 seconds, 15 frames, and currently 30 frames per second. So 15 frames is half a second. Now, I don't want to draw that many frames. I mean, 3 seconds times 30, that's 90. This is 105 frames. I don't want to draw 105 images for this animation. So with my source selected, well, it doesn't really matter. The source is 30 frames per second. If I go into the panel menu, I can look at the frame rate for my timeline. If I open that up, you see it's basically 30 frames per second, 29.97. That's kind of a technical thing, but video originally had this frame rate, and it's just based on, well, physics actually. If you look at the options here, in high def video, you can have 29.97, or you can have 30, you can have 50 or 60. You can also have a film rate. So if you have a movie transferred to video, movies are 24 frames per second, so you might see this. British television is 25 frames per second. In America, it's 30 frames per second by default, but high def video allows all of these from 23.976 up to 60. Those are all legal within the definition of high def video. Now, if you have something you're doing 30 frames per second, but you only want to draw every other frame, you could do 15 frames per second for your timeline, and then you're just drawing 15 images per second. I'm going to do 10. So that's drawing one image for every 3 video frames. In animation, this would be called animating on 3s, as opposed to animating on 2s. If you're working in film, where your frame rate is 24, animating on 2s would be 12. And you can actually type in any frame rate you want here, but I'm going to go with 10. Click OK. Now our timeline has gotten shorter. Open it up here. And as I scrub through, there's a lot more movement between each frame. So it's not as smooth, but it's fine for rotoscoping usually. If I look at the timeline now, the end shows as 3 seconds and 4 frames because I have 1/3 as many frames on my timeline. My source video is still 30 frames per second, but it's only showing me every 3rd frame on my timeline. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So to finish setting things up, I have to actually create the layer that I'm painting on, and I can have multiple layers. Go to Layer, Video Layers, create a new blank video layer. And so this is the one I'm painting on, at least one of them. And then I have my source, I have a background, which I'm going to lock because I never want to be painting on that. If I make a copy of my background, I can put it above my source, unlock it, change the transparency so I can see the source well enough to paint from, but at the same time lock that, be able to see my brush strokes here. Now you may have noticed that when I brought this video layer in, it came in where the time indicator is. Okay, so now I'm set up to paint. One thing to check is your keyboard shortcuts. You can't see it, it's just off screen here. If I go into panel menus and select timeline video, these are the shortcuts available. And you used to have to set these, but it looks like they have new defaults here to go to the next frame and the previous frame. Control period and control comma, which are right above the control key. So the period and comma, it makes it really easy to position your hands and go forward to the next frame, and the next frame. And this is important because when you're drawing, you don't want to take your brush away from the canvas. You want to stay in position drawing on the screen. So to demonstrate that, let me select a different color. Let's do something a little more subtle here, just for sketching stuff in. And it makes sense to work with your color from the image. Yeah, so in fact, let me start with her hair. So I'm going to select a color that I think might work. Select a brush, and this is just the pressure sensitive brush. Undo that, and position my hands over the keyboard, and I am going to just kind of sketch in a line here, maybe a couple lines to get an idea where her hair is. So Control plus, I go to the next frame, and I recommend only doing like a single brush stroke or two, so you can have some consistency from frame to frame here. So I'm going back and forth. If you do a whole bunch of stuff, then you kind of lose track of what you're doing. You spend too much time working on a single frame and then go to the next frame, lots of things will have changed. And I'm not sure why my brush got softer. I don't remember doing anything to my brush. Okay. Undo that one. So trying to have some consistency here. Nice thing about painting on the computer is that if you don't like a brush stroke, you can undo it, put in another one. Okay, so I've drawn all the way through to the end here. I'm going to play that and see, how well it, follows. There's a lot more bounce in my brushstroke than there is in her. To see it play back without the source, I could hide the source layer and just see my animation by itself. Obviously, there's a long way to go here. Just getting a little bit of sense of how her hair is moving on her body. I'd progress like this, adding more contour lines, and then at some point I'd probably go in and create another video layer underneath. It would be more of like a fill color. And with that, I would go in and like select a skin tone, start working like underneath this. So perhaps I was working with the clothing, and I would go in here and select a a color from her clothing, go back to the fill layer, go to the first frame, I have to move my fill layer into position. Now I can paint on it because now it exists on the frame that I'm working on. It took me a minute to figure out what was going on there. So I have my fill layer selected, my brush, then I could go in here and work on a layer below where I have the hair going. So I could try something like this. Going through every frame. Just toggling back and forth to see what I have going there. So she's got a little bit of a shoulder motion going. So I would continue along these lines until I'm finished. Then I would hide my source image, show the background, go to File, Export, Render Video. Now you have your original Photoshop document, which is your original. So then you can just render out to the Adobe Media Encoder, H.264, high quality, full 1280 by 720. Now here, if you were painting in a larger resolution, you could render it out to 1280 by 720 so you have a smaller file to upload to YouTube and to submit to the class.